The kingdom of Valenor believed it knew its ruler. King Aldric stood on balconies in polished armor, waving to cheering crowds as priests praised his wisdom and bards sang of his strength. Coins carried his face, laws carried his seal, and history carried his name. To the people, he was the mind and muscle of the realm. But power rarely sits where it is seen. Behind the throne, behind the banners and applause, another force shaped every decision. Her name was Queen Elara. Elara arrived at the palace as a girl promised in marriage, not leadership. She was taught to smile, to agree, and to remain silent while men discussed war, taxes, and borders. At feasts, she was decoration. At councils, she was ignored. Yet Elara listened. She noticed which nobles exaggerated victories, which generals feared winter more than enemies, and which ministers always spoke last, after learning the room's mood. While the king grew impatient with numbers and maps, Elara studied them in private. She memorized grain yields, trade routes, and the quiet tension between rival families. King Aldric despised long meetings. When council sessions dragged on, he waved them away and asked Elara to summarize later. That was the moment power shifted. Elara began drafting decisions, framing choices, and presenting outcomes in ways Aldric preferred. He believed he was deciding. In truth, he was approving. Decrees carried his signature, but her logic. Alliances formed because she predicted resentment. Taxes fell where she knew they would not break the poor. Borders held because she understood which threats were real and which were noise. The kingdom prospered slowly, then visibly. Trade expanded, rebellions faded before they began. Aldric was praised as a natural ruler, a king chosen by fate. Elara stood beside him, applauding softly, knowing the cost of being unseen. She ruled without a crown, without credit, and without the luxury of failure. For if the kingdom fell, history would blame the king, but Elara would know the truth. The throne was occupied by a man. The kingdom was run by a woman no one was watching.
Silence was never forced upon Elara. She chose it. In the royal court of Valenor, loud voices were mistaken for strong minds, and confident gestures were treated as proof of wisdom. Elara understood early that speaking less made others careless. When men believed her harmless, they revealed everything. She listened while ministers argued, learning who defended the treasury and who secretly drained it. She watched generals posture over maps, noticing which ones feared supply lines more than enemy blades. Every word spoken around her became a lesson. No one officially taught Elara how to rule. Women were excluded from formal education in politics, so she educated herself. Late at night she read old treaties, forgotten laws, and the journals of failed kings. Patterns emerged. Kingdoms did not fall from invasion alone. They collapsed from pride, hunger, and ignored warnings. Elara trained herself to see consequences where others saw opportunity. She learned that timing mattered more than strength, and that mercy, when used correctly, could be more terrifying than punishment. When King Aldric asked for her thoughts, Elara never offered answers directly. She asked questions instead. What will the people think? How long can the treasury last? What happens after the victory? These questions guided Aldric toward conclusions he believed were his own. Each success reinforced his confidence and her invisibility. The court praised a decisive king, unaware that his certainty was carefully constructed. Silence also protected Elara. Open influence would have made her a target in a court ruled by ambition and jealousy. By remaining unseen, she moved freely. She built quiet relationships with scribes, merchants, and messengers, the people who truly knew how the kingdom functioned. Through them, Elara learned more than any council could reveal. She discovered that real power lived in supply chains, rumors, and trust, not in thrones or swords. Over time, silence became her language. Every pause was deliberate, every nod was calculated. Elara was not weak, she was patient. And patience, she learned, was the sharpest weapon in a kingdom that believed it was ruled by a man who spoke loudly, while ignoring the woman who spoke only when it mattered.
The famine arrived quietly, without drums or warnings. One season the eastern fields simply failed. Rain never came, soil cracked open, and grain stores emptied faster than expected. Merchants raised prices overnight, and whispers spread through villages and marketplaces. Hunger always speaks first in murmurs before it screams in riots. King Aldric noticed the problem only when petitions began piling on his desk. Panic followed pride. His answer was swift and cruelly simple: raise taxes, seize private grain, and import food by force. Elara saw the disaster forming long before the first riot. Higher taxes would break farmers already on their knees. Forced seizures would turn loyalty into hatred. Soldiers sent to control food would soon face their own starving families. She spoke carefully, never contradicting the king. Instead, she reframed the crisis as opportunity. Mercy now, she suggested, will be remembered longer than punishment. She proposed opening the royal reserves, delaying tax collection, and using temples as distribution centers. Aldric agreed, convinced the plan would make him beloved. While the king prepared speeches, Elara worked without rest. She dispatched secret envoys to neighboring regions, negotiating trade routes before shortages spread. She coordinated scribes, priests, and local leaders to prevent hoarding. Grain moved quietly under guard, not to display power, but to preserve dignity. Hunger eased before rage could take shape. The people praised the king's generosity, believing their ruler had chosen compassion over control. When the harvest finally returned, Valenor stood intact. No cities burned, no banners were torn down. Bards sang of Aldric the Merciful, the king who saved his people from starvation. Elara listened from the palace shadows, exhausted and invisible. She had learned something vital. A kingdom could survive famine, but not arrogance. Power, she realized, was not about commanding obedience. It was about preventing desperation. And once again, history applauded the throne, never seeing the woman who had stopped the kingdom from tearing itself apart. Stability breeds suspicion. As Valenor grew calmer and crises faded before reaching the streets, certain nobles began to feel uneasy. Kingdoms were not supposed to function this smoothly. Someone, they sensed, was shaping events before they became disasters. Their eyes turned toward the throne, but the king seemed unchanged, loud, proud, and careless. Slowly, attention drifted toward the queen, who spoke little and observed too much. Whispers moved through marble halls. Elara was accused of influence without proof, ambition without title. Some lords mocked her openly, others watched her closely. Elara understood the danger immediately. Influence that is seen becomes influence that is attacked. She responded not with defense, but misdirection. She praised her rivals publicly, elevated their egos, and then redirected them away from the center of power. Ambitious men were sent to govern distant provinces. Clever schemers were rewarded with marriages that softened their hunger for control. Those who refused distraction were handled more quietly. Elara used information instead of force. Corrupt tax collectors were exposed through anonymous audits. Disloyal generals found their supply lines questioned, their reputations weakened without accusation. No single move could be traced back to her. Problems simply disappeared. The court assumed fortune favored the king once again. King Aldric noticed none of it. He believed loyalty was natural and enemies rare. Elara let him believe it. She understood that protecting the illusion of his authority protected the kingdom itself. A shaken king would panic. A confident one could be guided. By the end of the year, opposition within the court had dissolved. Some nobles left, some adapted, some fell silent. Order remained. Elara paid the price in isolation. She trusted fewer people, slept less, and carried secrets she could never share. Power without recognition demanded constant vigilance, and as Valenor slept peacefully, its unseen guardian prepared for the truth she feared most. External threats were easier to defeat than the ones born inside the palace walls.
Of war arrived wrapped in pride. Scouts reported enemy movement near Valenor's northern border. Troops gathering, banners raised, a challenge waiting to be answered. King Aldric welcomed the news. War, he believed, would carve his name into history. Victory would silence critics and secure his legacy. He summoned generals, demanded battle plans, and spoke of honor as if it were currency. Elara saw something else. The enemy force was large but poorly supplied. Their leaders sought intimidation, not invasion. War would cost Valenor far more than it would gain. Drained coffers, lost farmers, and a weakened future. Elara acted before momentum could turn into bloodshed. She advised defensive preparations while secretly opening diplomatic channels. Fortifications were strengthened, not to fight, but to discourage attack. At the same time, envoys carried gifts, promises, and carefully chosen threats across the border. While Aldric imagined glory, Elara studied fear. She learned what the enemy lacked: food, allies, and time. She delayed negotiations just long enough for winter to approach, making invasion impossible. Rumors were spread of Valenor's readiness and hidden reserves. The enemy withdrew without a single blade drawn. When the troops returned home, Aldric declared victory. The court applauded. Bards sang of a king so powerful that enemies fled before him. Elara accepted the praise as always, from a distance. She had prevented a war that would have shattered the kingdom, yet no monument would mark her choice. Peace, she knew, was invisible. There were no parades for battles avoided, no statues for blood never spilled. That night, Elara stood alone on the palace walls, watching torches fade beyond the horizon. She understood a cruel truth of power. The greatest victories are the ones no one sees, and the ruler who truly protects a kingdom is often the one history forgets.
As the years passed, Valenor thrived. Trade routes expanded, rebellions vanished before forming, and neighboring rulers spoke the kingdom's name with caution and respect. To the people, this age became known as Aldric's Golden Reign. To Elara, it became an era of quiet exhaustion. Power carried weight, and when carried alone, it bent even the strongest spine. Elara could not celebrate victories. She could not share credit or confess fear. Every success tightened the mask she wore. The more the kingdom relied on her unseen guidance, the less room she had to exist as anything other than its protector. Friendships faded. Trust became a liability. Even sleep felt dangerous. A single mistake would not expose her. It would destroy the illusion holding the realm together. King Aldric grew accustomed to triumph. Praise fed his pride, and pride dulled his caution. He dismissed warnings more often, assuming fortune would correct his errors. Elara worked harder to compensate, steering decisions with increasing precision. She began to realize the kingdom did not simply need guidance, it depended on her restraint. If she ever stopped correcting the course, Valenor would drift toward chaos. The strain showed in quiet ways. Elara aged faster than her years. She felt the loneliness of command without recognition, the burden of knowing that if she failed, history would never know why. She questioned whether her silence protected the kingdom or trapped it, but the answer always returned the same. Speaking openly would fracture the court, weaken the king, and invite instability. So Elara remained unseen. She paid the cost willingly, believing the kingdom's peace was worth her anonymity. Yet deep within, a dangerous thought took shape. If all stability depended on one invisible woman, what would happen when she could no longer bear the weight? Power hidden too long, she realized, becomes fragile, and Valenor's future rested on a truth no one dared to acknowledge. Success reshaped King Aldric in subtle but dangerous ways. Years of unchallenged praise convinced him that victory followed his will alone. Advisors who once argued now agreed without question. Warnings were dismissed as cowardice, caution mistaken for weakness. Aldric began to believe that fate favored him personally, not the kingdom. Elara watched the change with growing concern. Confidence could be guided, arrogance could not. The first signs appeared in small decisions. Aldric ignored trade imbalances, assuming merchants would adapt. He postponed maintenance of border forts, believing neighbors feared him too much to attack. When Elara raised concerns, he laughed them away, reminding her of how often his instincts had proven right. For the first time, Elara felt resistance, not from enemies, but from the man she had spent years protecting. To compensate, Elara worked around him. She strengthened local leaders, empowered regional councils, and built redundancies into the kingdom's systems. If the king failed, the realm might still endure. Yet every workaround deepened the lie. Aldric's authority appeared absolute while becoming increasingly hollow. The court sensed the shift. Flatterers replaced thinkers. Ambitious nobles fed the king's ego, pushing him toward bold gestures and public displays of power. Elara recognized the pattern from old histories. This was how golden ages ended, not with invasion, but with pride unchecked by consequence. One night, Aldric announced plans for a grand expansion project, a massive fortress city meant to display Valenor's dominance. The treasury could not sustain it. The people would suffer. Elara objected openly for the first time. Aldric dismissed her concerns before the court. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. For the first time in years, Elara realized her influence was no longer guaranteed. She withdrew that night, shaken. Power, she understood, was not permanent, even when earned. The kingdom she had guided now stood at the edge of a different danger, a ruler who no longer needed her counsel. And for the first time, Elara faced the possibility that silence might no longer be enough to save Valenor. Time did what enemies never could. It changed the king.
Years of praise reshaped Aldric's mind until caution felt like insult and advice sounded like doubt. Victories that were never fought, crises that never reached the streets, and a kingdom that seemed to correct itself convinced him of one thing: he was untouchable. Elara watched the transformation with quiet alarm. Confidence could rule, arrogance destroyed. Aldric began to act without consultation. Trade agreements were announced publicly before being negotiated. Taxes were adjusted to fund grand displays rather than necessities. He dismissed experienced advisors, replacing them with men who echoed his certainty. When Elara questioned these choices, he smiled and reminded her of how often his instincts had saved the realm. The illusion was complete. He believed his success was proof of destiny. Elara adapted as she always had, but the work grew heavier. She reinforced systems beneath the surface, empowering local leaders and securing emergency reserves. If the king fell, the kingdom might survive. Yet every hidden correction weakened her influence further. Aldric no longer needed guidance, he needed admiration. The court sensed opportunity. Flatterers gathered, feeding the king's hunger for greatness. Ambitious nobles encouraged bold visions, expansion, monuments, legacy. Elara recognized the signs from forgotten reigns she had studied in secret. Golden ages did not end in fire, they ended in excess. The breaking point came during a public council. Aldric announced a massive construction project meant to symbolize Valenor's dominance. The treasury could not support it, the people would pay the price. Elara spoke, calmly, carefully, but openly. Aldric dismissed her concerns before the court, laughing as if she were afraid of greatness. The silence that followed was devastating. For the first time, Elara understood her greatest fear was no longer exposure. It was irrelevance. A kingdom guided too long in shadows had begun to believe it no longer needed the shadow at all. And in that moment, Elara realized that silence, the tool that once saved Valenor, might soon be the reason it fell.
The court felt different after that council. Conversations paused when Elara entered. Eyes lingered longer than before, no longer dismissive but measuring. Her moment of open disagreement had shifted something fragile. The illusion that she was merely a silent queen had cracked, and cracks invite scrutiny. Elara sensed it immediately. Power that had survived unseen for years was now being examined under light it was never meant to face. Nobles whispered more boldly. Some wondered aloud how the king had become so successful so quickly. Others suggested the queen's influence had grown unnatural. A few ambitious lords saw opportunity. If Elara fell, they might finally step closer to the throne. Elara responded as she always had, with patience. She withdrew from public councils, spoke less, and let the king's new advisors fill the silence. If they wished to test Aldric's instincts, she would not stop them. The consequences arrived swiftly. Trade negotiations stalled. Local governors complained of confusion. Funds were redirected without foresight, causing shortages in places once stable. None of it was catastrophic, yet, but Elara recognized the pattern. Small errors, unchecked, grew sharp edges. Privately, Elara prepared. She strengthened communication networks, secured loyal messengers, and ensured emergency protocols remained intact. If chaos erupted, she would act. Until then, she observed. The court mistook her silence for defeat. They grew careless, revealing rivalries and ambitions she had long suspected but never confirmed. King Aldric, surrounded by praise, noticed none of it. He mistook attention for loyalty and admiration for truth. Elara watched him drift further from reality, understanding that the greatest danger was no longer external threats, but a court convinced it could rule without restraint. By the end of the season, one truth was clear. Valenor stood at a crossroads. Either the kingdom would remember the value of quiet wisdom, or it would learn, painfully, what happened when experience was dismissed as fear. and as the court turned its gaze fully upon her, Elara prepared for the moment when observation would no longer be enough.
The warning came too late for anyone but Elara. Trade caravans stopped arriving on schedule. Border governors sent confused, conflicting reports. Grain prices rose again, not from famine but from mismanagement. Decisions once filtered through careful logic now collided in chaos. King Aldric's court was loud, confident, and disastrously uncoordinated. Elara watched the signs align like a storm on the horizon. This was not a single failure, it was systemic unraveling. When the first protest erupted in the capital, Aldric was furious rather than concerned. He ordered guards into the streets, believing force would restore order. Elara understood how quickly that choice could ignite rebellion. Acting without permission, she activated networks she had built years earlier. Temple leaders calmed crowds. Merchants were quietly assured of future relief. Governors received revised instructions that corrected the king's errors without challenging his authority. For days Elara worked in constant motion, sleeping in fragments, trusting only those she had tested over years. Riots faded before spreading. Supply lines reopened. The crisis dissolved quietly, leaving the public unaware of how close Valenor had come to collapse. Aldric claimed credit, declaring firmness had preserved peace. The court applauded. Elara said nothing. That silence nearly destroyed her. She realized that the kingdom was no longer stable. It was fragile, balanced on her endurance alone. One illness, one delay, one mistake would have ended everything. Valenor had not survived because it was strong. It survived because she was still standing. That night, Elara faced a truth she could no longer ignore. Protecting the kingdom from collapse was no longer enough. A system that required invisibility to function was already broken. If Aldric continued unchecked, the next crisis would not end quietly, and when it came, silence would not save the crown or the woman who had held it together from the shadows.
Elara stood at the edge of a decision she had avoided for years. The crisis had passed, but the cost was clear. Valenor was no longer governed, it was being corrected. Every flaw in Aldric's rule demanded her silent intervention, and each correction weakened the foundation further. A kingdom could not survive forever on hidden hands and unspoken truths. For the first time, Elara considered revealing herself, not as a ruler, but as a force the court could no longer ignore. The thought was dangerous. Exposure would invite resistance, fracture alliances, and possibly ignite the very chaos she had spent her life preventing. Yet remaining silent promised something worse, inevitable collapse. She began testing the ground carefully. Trusted governors were given authority openly rather than through whispered instruction. Financial records were reorganized to reveal patterns even Aldric could not ignore. When advisors failed publicly, Elara did not intervene. Let failure speak. The court grew uneasy as confidence cracked. Aldric noticed the change. Accustomed to smooth outcomes, he felt the absence of invisible support. Frustration replaced pride. He demanded explanations that no one could give. Elara watched him struggle, understanding that truth could not be delivered gently anymore. Late one night, Elara walked through the archives, touching records she had shaped for decades.
She had built Valenor's stability piece by piece, never asking for recognition. Now she faced the possibility that saving the kingdom meant destroying the illusion that protected it. Power, she realized, was not control. It was responsibility. And responsibility demanded a choice: remain unseen and let Valenor decay behind a confident king, or step into the light and risk becoming the enemy of the very realm she loved. As dawn approached, Elara prepared for the moment when silence would no longer be her shield, but her greatest failure.
The moment arrived without ceremony. No trumpet announced it, no crowd gathered. It began in a council chamber filled with frustration. Trade routes were failing again, border lords argued openly, and the treasury bled under the weight of careless ambition. King Aldric shouted for solutions that never came. The men around him spoke loudly, said little, and blamed one another. For the first time in years, the room felt truly leaderless. Elara stood, and the sound of her chair moving silenced the chamber. She did not raise her voice, she did not accuse, she simply spoke with clarity. She outlined the failures, the causes and consequences, each decision traced back with precision. She spoke of grain reserves once opened, wars never fought, and crises prevented before they reached the streets. The room grew still as understanding replaced confusion. This was not opinion, this was memory. Aldric tried to interrupt. Elara continued. She revealed systems she had built quietly, supply networks, diplomatic channels, and emergency protocols. She named governors she had empowered, treaties she had shaped, and mistakes she had corrected. The truth spread through the room like fire. Faces paled, pride collapsed into shock. When she finished, silence returned, this time heavy with realization. The council understood what Valenor truly rested upon. King Aldric stared at her, not in anger, but disbelief. His greatness fractured in an instant, replaced by the knowledge that his reign had been curated, protected, and sustained by the woman he had dismissed as background. Elara did not demand power. She offered responsibility. She warned that the kingdom could not survive divided illusion. Either the truth was accepted, or collapse would follow. The choice was no longer hers alone. As the council adjourned, Valenor crossed a threshold. The crown still sat upon the king's head, but everyone in that room now knew who truly carried its weight, and nothing, Elara understood, would ever return to silence again. The days following Ilara's revelation were the quietest Valenor had known in years. Not the calm of peace, but the stillness before judgment. Word spread carefully, never officially announced, yet impossible to contain. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones. Governors waited for instruction. Even the streets seemed to listen. The kingdom sensed a shift, though few understood its cause. King Aldric withdrew. For the first time since his coronation, he avoided the council chamber. Pride wrestled with humiliation behind closed doors. He had been a king celebrated by history, only to learn his greatness rested on borrowed wisdom. Elara did not pursue him. She knew this reckoning could not be rushed. Authority taken too quickly would shatter what remained of stability. The council, stripped of illusion, began to function differently. Debates sharpened, decisions slowed, weighed carefully rather than rushed for spectacle. When disputes arose, eyes turned toward Elara, not in challenge, but expectation. She spoke only when necessary, guiding without dominating. Valenor was learning to breathe again, this time with awareness. Outside the palace, rumors grew. Some praised the queen as savior. Others called her dangerous, unnatural, a threat to tradition. Elara accepted both reactions. Truth always divided those who benefited from lies and those who suffered beneath them. What mattered was that the kingdom no longer drifted blindly. Aldric returned to council one evening, quieter, older. He did not apologize. He did not accuse. He listened. For the first time, he asked questions instead of declaring answers. It was not redemption, but it was change. Valenor stood on uncertain ground, yet stronger for acknowledging it. The kingdom had survived famine, war, and pride. Now it faced something rarer and more dangerous: honesty. And as the realm held its breath, Elara understood that ruling openly would cost her more than ruling in silence ever had.
For the first time, Valenor knew her name, whispered in corridors, repeated in councils, acknowledged in hushed admiration. Queen Elara's influence could no longer be ignored. Recognition, however, was a double-edged sword. With credit came expectation, scrutiny, and danger. Those who had thrived under illusion now resented the truth. Power, once invisible, was suddenly visible and vulnerable. Elara felt the weight immediately. Decisions no longer moved quietly behind closed doors. Ministers sought her approval openly. Nobles pressed her for favor, sometimes politely, sometimes aggressively. The balance she had maintained for years teetered as old rivalries resurfaced, emboldened by the knowledge that the queen herself held sway over Valenor's fate. Every step forward required strategy sharper than any she had employed in silence. King Aldric, once the unchallenged figurehead, now faced a subtle humiliation. He had believed his reign depended on destiny alone, only to discover that it rested upon the quiet labor of the queen he had ignored. He reacted in ways both predictable and human, pride bruised, ego tested, but ultimately cautious. He deferred to her expertise where it mattered, though not without complaint. The court watched carefully, learning to navigate the new reality. Elara, for her part, understood that leadership had changed. She could no longer protect the kingdom simply by guiding from the shadows. Transparency demanded patience, diplomacy, and courage. Every decision carried visible consequences. She could not undo mistakes unseen. Every error would ripple outward, judged by both king and council. She had traded anonymity for authority, freedom for accountability. And yet, for the first time, she felt a fragile exhilaration. Recognition allowed her to shape not just outcomes, but understanding. Valenor could now see what had protected it for decades. The people, once oblivious, could learn that stability was neither magic nor luck, but careful stewardship. If she wielded this knowledge wisely, the kingdom might flourish in ways impossible under silence. But with visibility came risk. Enemies who had waited patiently now would strike openly. Allies might betray for the sake of influence.
Every choice would carry weight beyond the palace walls. Elara realized she had stepped onto a new battlefield, not of swords, but of eyes, judgment, and legacy. The real challenge of power had only just begun.
Recognition brought new dangers. With the queen no longer invisible, old enemies stirred, emboldened by the knowledge that their rival now wielded authority openly. Courtiers who had smiled in silence now whispered in shadows, plotting alliances and schemes that threatened the fragile stability Elara had spent decades cultivating. The palace, once predictable, became a maze of hidden agendas. Elara had anticipated envy, but not subtle treachery. Governors she had trained carefully began bypassing her directives, claiming independence. Advisors, once loyal, flattered her only to gather personal advantage. Even Aldric, though outwardly deferential, occasionally tested boundaries, asserting decisions that risked undermining her careful work. Each incident was a reminder: power exposed is power contested. She responded with precision. Surveillance became strategic observation. Records were audited more rigorously, messages cross-checked, and alliances rebalanced. Where possible, conflicts were redirected into safe outlets: marriages, titles, ceremonial roles. She worked quietly, but this time in plain sight, turning threats into manageable risks. Every move was calculated to preserve both stability and her credibility. Yet the cost weighed heavily. Trust, once abundant, became rare. Decisions carried tension. Every conversation was loaded with potential consequence. Sleep was punctuated by worry, even as the kingdom prospered outwardly. The public praised her wisdom, unaware of the invisible wars fought in council rooms, archives, and corridors. Elara realized that leadership in daylight demanded vigilance far beyond what she had known in shadows. Amid this, Aldric remained both obstacle and ally. His pride occasionally collided with her foresight, but he had learned the value of counsel he could not dismiss. They navigated a delicate partnership, one built on necessity, not affection. For the first time, the Queen understood that true power required not only strategy, but endurance, patience, and the ability to forgive small betrayals for the sake of the larger good. As seasons passed, Elara grew sharper, steadier, and more formidable. The kingdom remained prosperous, yet the lessons of betrayal lingered. She had achieved recognition, but she also understood a harsh truth. Visibility changes nothing about the demands of power. If anything, it amplifies them. And in Valenor, every victory carried the shadow of a coming challenge.
Years of invisible labor, silent guidance, and unacknowledged vigilance culminated in a moment of quiet triumph. Valenor had endured famine, threats of war, treacherous courts, and the arrogance of a king who once believed himself infallible. It stood strong, its people secure, and its borders safe. To the world, all of it was Aldric's doing. Statues bore his likeness, bards sang his name, and history books recorded his victories. Yet Elara knew the truth, and the weight of that truth had shaped her more profoundly than any crown could. She had learned that leadership is not the display of power, but the mastery of consequence. each crisis averted, each rebellion quelled, each negotiation turned toward peace had required strategy, endurance, and patience beyond what any visible ruler could command. And each act, performed in shadows, left her both exalted and isolated. Recognition had brought danger, but invisibility had demanded sacrifice. In the end, she had chosen the kingdom over herself every time. King Aldric, older now and tempered by reality, no longer assumed instinct alone could secure the realm. He sought her counsel more than ever, quietly acknowledging her role in ways words could not express. Their partnership had evolved, no longer a king relying blindly, nor a queen hidden entirely, but a delicate balance of guidance, respect, and restraint. Aldric remained the face of the crown, yet Elara had become the unseen spine that held it upright. The court had learned its lessons too. Ambition was measured, decisions scrutinized, and loyalty weighed with caution. Those who had plotted against her now understood that Valenor's stability depended on her wisdom. The kingdom had survived, but at the cost of its greatest secret, the woman who had truly run it. In her private chambers, Elara allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She looked over maps, ledgers, and treaties she had shaped, tracing decades of meticulous care. A faint smile crossed her face, not for fame, not for accolades, but for the knowledge that she had fulfilled a duty greater than recognition. The people slept safely, borders remained secure, alliances held. History would credit the king, but Valenor knew survival, and that was enough. Her legacy, she realized, would live not in statues or songs, but in the quiet endurance of a kingdom that thrived because someone had chosen to act, even when the world could not see her. Power, she understood at last, is less about being known, and more about ensuring that what matters lasts. And in that, Queen Elara had succeeded beyond measure.